Well, when last we left the life of Boswell, Boswell was being initiated into the literary club. So let's see this today, whether or not he's going to get paddled or not. Goldsmith produced some very absurd verses which had been publicly recited to an audience for money. Johnson said, "I can match this nonsense. There was a poem called Eugenio, which came out some years ago and concludes thus. And now, ye trifling, self-assuming elves, brimful of pride, of nothing, of yourselves, survey Eugenio, view him o'er and o'er, then sink into yourselves and be no more." Shall I read this long footnote? I guess I have no choice. Dr. Johnson's memory here was not perfectly accurate. Eugenio does not conclude thus. There are 8 more lines after this last of these quoted by him, and the passage which he meant to recite is as follows. "Say now, ye fluttering, poor assuming elves, stark full of pride, of folly, of yourselves, say where the wretch of your impious crew, who dares confront his character to view? Behold Eugenio, view him o'er and o'er, then sink into yourselves and be no more." Mr. Reed informs me that the author of Eugenio, a wine merchant at Wrexham in Denbighshire, soon after its publication, viz. the 17th of May, 1737, cut his own throat, and that it appears by Swift's works that the poem had been showed to him and received some of his corrections. Johnson had read Eugenio on his first coming into town, for we see it mentioned in one of his letters to Mr. Cave, which had been inserted in this work. If you will return back to page 89, it was a long fucking time ago, and I'm not going to do it. Anyway, I believe Johnson is still talking here. Nay, Dryden in his poem on the Royal Society has these lines. "Then we upon our global last verge shall go, and see the ocean leaning on the sky. From thence our rolling neighbors we shall know, and on the lunar world securely pry." Talking of puns, Johnson, who had a great contempt for that species of wit, deigned to allow that there was one good pun in Menagiana, I think, on the word corpse. Footnote here again. I formerly thought that I had perhaps mistaken the word and imagined it to be corpse, from its similarity of sound to the real one. For an accurate and shrewd unknown gentleman to whom I had indebted for some remarks on my work observes on this passage, Q. If not on the word fort, a vociferous French preacher said to Baudelaire, "Il prehe fort ben et more fiat fort, Menagiana." See also Anecdotes Literates Articles Bourdonne. So that's somebody talking to Boswell. But my ingenious and obliging correspondent, Mr. Abercrombie of Philadelphia, has pointed out to me the following passage in Menagiana, which renders the preceding conjecture unnecessary and confirms my original statement. Quote, Madme de Bourdonne, Chanoinesse, I don't know how to pronounce that, that's probably totally wrong, Chanoinesse de Remiremont, venoit de entendre. Oh crap, this is all in different language. So I'm going to stop reading right there, but there's a bunch of stuff in French. And it appears that there is a play at the end that says "Quel est the spirit," and then something about corpse. So, unfortunately, I'm going to have to look this up and post it in my comments for discussion, because it's not translated here. I have a big problem with the footnotes of this book, because most of them are just either Boswell nitpicking about some bullshit, or somebody writing in that was affronted by some slight little thing he wrote and wants to correct it, even though it makes them look worse by making comment about it. Or, yeah, it's mostly those two things. And I appreciate that there's footnotes to the Latin where they give the translation, but for the French and Italian, there's never any translation, so... or usually there isn't. So, it just seems like, why isn't there one right there? I don't know. Well, now that we're all completely lost, let's return back to what's going on. Much pleasant conversation passed, which Johnson relished with great good humor, but his conversation alone, or what led to it, or what was interwoven with it, is the business of the work. On Saturday, May 11th, On Saturday, May 1st, we dined by ourselves at our old rendezvous, the Mitre Tavern. He was placid, but not much disposed to talk. He observed that, quote, the Irish mix better with the English than the Scotch do. Their languages is nearer to English, as a proof of which they succeed very well as players, which Scottishmen do not. Then, sir, they have not the extreme nationality which we find in the Scotch. Well, little does he know. I will do you, Boswell, the justice to say that you are the most unscotsified of your countrymen. You are almost the only instance of a Scotchman that I have known who did not at every other sentence bring in some other Scotchman. A lot of foreplay between these two about Scotchness. We drank tea with Mrs. Williams. I introduced a question which had been much agitated in the Church of Scotland, whether the claim of lay patrons to present ministers to parishes be well-founded, and supposing it be well-founded, whether it ought to be exercised without the concurrence of the people. That church is composed of a series of judicatures, a presbytery, a synod, and finally a general assembly, before all which the matter may be contended, and in some cases the presbytery having refused to induct or settle, as they call it, the person presented by the patron, it has been found necessary to appeal to the general assembly. Really pressing issue. Johnson said, I might see the subject well treated in the defense of pluralities, and although he thought that a patron should exercise his right with tenderness to the inclinations of the people of a parish, he was very clear as to his right. Then, supposing the question to be pleaded before the General Assembly, he dictated to me what follows. Okay, here we go. Another long screed by Johnson that Boswell annotated, or not annotated, what's the word I'm thinking of? Wrote down. Against the right of patrons is commonly opposed by the inferior judicatures the plea of conscience. Their conscience tells them that the people ought to choose their pastor. Their conscience tells them that they ought not to impose upon a congregation a minister ungrateful and unacceptable to his auditors. Conscience is nothing more than a conviction felt by ourselves of something to be done, or something to be avoided. And in questions of simple, unperplexed morality, conscience is very often a guide that may be trusted. But before conscience can determine, the state of the question is supposed to be completely known. In questions of law, or in fact, conscience is very often confounded with opinion. No man's conscience can tell him the rights of another man. They must be known by rational investigations or historical inquiry. Opinion, which he that holds it may call his conscience, may teach some men that religion would be promoted and quiet preserved by granting to the people universally the choice of their ministers. But it is a conscience very ill-informed that violates the rights of one man for the convenience of another. Religion cannot be promoted by injustice, and it was never yet found that a popular election was very quietly transacted. That justice would be violated by transferring to the people the right of patronage is apparent to all who know whence that right has its original. The right of patronage was not at first a privilege torn by power from unresisting poverty. It is not an authority at first usurped in times of ignorance and established only by succession and by precedents. It is not a grant capriciously made from the higher tyrant to a lower. It is a right dearly purchased by the first possessors, and justly inherited by those that succeeded them. When Christianity was established in this island, a regular mode of public worship was prescribed. Public worship requires a public place, and the proprietors of lands, as they were converted, built churches for their families and their vassals. For the maintenance of ministers, they settled a certain portion of their lands, and a district, through which each minister was required to exist his cares, was, by that circumscription, constituted a parish. This is a position so generally received in England that the extent of a manor and of a parish are regularly received for each other. The churches which the proprietors of lands had thus built and thus endowed, they justly thought themselves entitled to provide with ministers. And where the episcopal government prevails, the bishop has no power to reject a man nominated by the patron, but for some crime that might exclude him from the priesthood. For the endowment of the church being the gift of the landlord, he was consequently at liberty to give it according to his choice to any man capable of performing the holy offices. The people did not choose him because the people did not pay him. We hear it sometimes urged that this original right is passed out of memory and is obliterated and obscured by many translations of property and changes of government, that scarce any church is now in the hands of the heirs of the builders, and that the present persons have entered subsequently upon the pretended rights by 1,000 accidental and unknown causes. Much of this perhaps is true, but how is the right of patronage extinguished? If the right followed the lands, it is possessed by the same equity by which the lands are possessed. It is in effect part of the manor, and protected by the same laws with every other privilege. Let us suppose an estate fortified by treason and granted by the crown to a new family. With the lands were fortified, forfeited all the rights pendant to those lands. By the same power that grants the lands, the rights are also granted. The right lost to the patron falls not to the people, but is either retained by the crown, or what to the people is the same thing, is by the crown given away. Let it change hands ever so often. It is possessed by him that receives it with the same rights as it was conveyed. It may indeed, like all our possessions, be forcibly seized or fraudulently obtained. But no injury is still done to the people, for what they never had, they have never lost. Caius may usurp the rights of Titus, but neither Caius nor Titus injure the people. And no man's conscience, however tender or however active, can prompt him to restore what may be proved to have been never taken away. Supposing, what I think cannot be proved, that a popular election of ministers were to be desired, our desires are not the measure of equity. It were to be desired that power should be only in the hands of the merciful, and riches in the possession of the generous, but the law must leave both riches and power where it finds them. It must often leave riches with the covetous and power with the cruel. Convenience may be a rule in little things, where no other rule has been established. But as the great end of government is to give every man his own, no inconvenience is greater than that of making right uncertain. Nor is any man more an enemy to public peace than he who fills weak heads with imaginary claims and breaks the series of civil subordination by inciting the lower classes of mankind to encroach upon the higher. Having thus shown that the right of patronage, being originally purchased, may be legally transferred, and that it is now in the hands of lawful possessors, at least as certainly as any other right, we have left to the advocates of the people no other plea than that of convenience. Let us therefore now consider what the people would really gain by a general abolition of the rights of patronage. What is most to be desired by such a change is that the country should be supplied with better ministers. But why should we suppose that the parish will make a wiser choice than the patron? If we suppose mankind actuated by interest, the patron is more likely to choose with caution because he will suffer more by choosing wrong. By the deficiencies of his minister, or by his vices, he is equally offended with the rest of the congregation. But he will have this reason more to lament them, that they will be imputed to his absurdity or corruption. The qualifications of a minister are well known to be learning and piety. Of his learning, the patron is probably the only judge in the parish, and of his piety not less a judge than others, and is more likely to inquire minutely and diligently before he gives a presentation than one of the parochial rabble, who can give nothing but a vote. It may be urged that, though the parish might not choose better ministers, they would at least choose ministers whom they liked better, and who would therefore officiate with greater efficacy. That ignorance and perversiveness should always obtain what they like was never considered at the end of government, of which it is the great and standing benefit that the wise see for the simple, and the regular act for the capricious. But that this argument supposes the people capable of judging and resolute to act according to their best judgments, though this be sufficiently absurd, it is not at all its absurdity. It supposes not only wisdom, but unanimity in those who upon no other occasions are unanimous or wise. If by some strange concurrence all the voices of a parish should unite in the choice of one single man, though I could not charge the patron with injustice for presenting a minister, I should censure him as unkind and injudicious. But as it is evident that, as in all other popular elections, there will be contrariety of judgment and acrimony of passion, the parish upon every vacancy would break into factions, and the contest for the choice of a minister would set neighbors at variance and bring discord into families. The minister would be taught in all the arts of a candidate. The minister would be taught all the arts of a candidate, would flatter some and bribe others, and the electors, as in all other cases, would call for holidays and ale, and break the heads of each other during the jollity of the canvass. The time must, however, come at last, when one of the factors must prevail, and one of the ministers gets possession of the church. On what terms does he enter upon the ministry but those of amity with half his parish? By what prudence or what diligence can be hoped to conciliate the affections of that party by whose defeat he has obtained his living? Every man who voted against him will enter the church with hanging head and downcast eyes, afraid to encounter that neighbor by whose vote and influence he has been overpowered. He will hate his neighbor for opposing him, and his minister for having prospered by the opposition. And as he will never see him but with pain, he will never see him but with hatred. Of a minister presented by the patron, the parish has seldom anything worse to say than that they do not know him. Of a minister chosen by a popular contest, all those who do not favor him have nursed up in their bosoms principles of hatred and reasons of rejection. Anger is excited principally by pride. The pride of a common man is very little exasperated by the supposed usurpation of an acknowledged superior. He bears only his little share of a general evil, and suffers in common with the whole parish. But when the contest is between equals, the defeat has many aggravations, and he that is defeated by his next neighbor is seldom satisfied without some revenge, and it is hard to say what bitterness of malignity would prevail in a parish where these elections should happen to be frequent, and the enmity of a position should be rekindled before it had cooled. Though I present to my readers Dr. Johnson's masterly thoughts on the subject, I think it proper to declare that, notwithstanding I am myself a lay patron, I do not entirely subscribe to his opinion. Well, that's pretty good. Pretty good call against democracy. So that's interesting to read, huh? I can't help but think about it in terms of the democratic process right now in America. So pitted against each other. But it'll be interesting to see what he has to come to say when America is really founded in a couple years, and he doesn't seem like he'd be quite the fan of it, and I don't think he is. So it'll be interesting to see what he says then. Anyway, till next time, bye from Boswell.